I'm writing this 3 weeks after coming home, and I still haven't told anyone in my life about what happened. Not properly. I told my flatmate Priya that I came back early because the weather turned, which is the kind of lie that's easy to believe about Dartmoor in August, apparently, because she just made a sympathetic face and poured me a glass of wine, and that was the end of it. The truth is, I left because I encountered something out there. And whatever it wasn't a person. I should give you context. I'm not the kind of person who goes camping. I work in digital project management. I live in a 2-bed flat in Bristol. I own an espresso machine and a good sofa. The most outdoor thing I did in my 20s was a Tough Mudder in 2019, and I complained about it for 6 months afterwards. So when I say I decided to take a week's wild camping trip on Dartmoor alone, you should understand that this wasn't a normal decision for me. I've been burning out for about a year. Not dramatically, no crying in toilets or anything. Just that dull, constant sense of running slightly below empty. My therapist had been gently suggesting I disconnect for a while, and I'd been ignoring her in the polite way that I ignore most useful advice. And then one Thursday in July, I was sitting at my desk at 7 p.m, eating a sandwich that I'd bought at noon and forgotten about, and I thought, I'm going to leave. Just go somewhere with no signal and no people to try and impress. I booked the time off that night. I did actual research. I watched YouTube videos about wild camping on Dartmoor, read the Dartmoor National Park guidelines about where you can pitch, bought a decent 2-man tent with a proper waterproof rating, and a sleeping bag rated to 5 degrees Celsius because nights can get cold even in summer. I even got a padlock for the zipper, one of those small combination ones you can thread through the zipper pulls, because I'd read something online about keeping your tent secure if you're camping alone in remote areas. At the time, I thought it was slightly paranoid, but looking back now, I'm very glad I had it. I drove down from Bristol on the first Saturday of August. The moor hits you differently than I expected. I'd been imagining something grimly dramatic, all brooding skies and gothic atmosphere, but when I arrived, it was just vast and golden, and very, very quiet. I found a spot near a rocky outcropping maybe 1.5 miles from the nearest car park, pitched my tent, ate a camp meal that tasted better than it had any right to, and fell asleep to what I can only describe as proper silence. The city kind of silence is always underlaid with something. Traffic, someone's music, the ambient hum of being near 1 million other people. This was different. This was genuine nothing, and I hadn't realised until then just how much I'd needed it. The first 2 nights were perfect, and I mean that without irony. I hiked during the days, took photos of the tours, ate badly but happily, and read a novel I'd been meaning to get to for 2 years. On the second evening, I sat outside my tent with a cup of coffee, watching the light change over the moor until it got dark. And I felt, for the first time in a long time, like an actual human being, rather than a content management system that occasionally ate sandwiches. The third night is when the sound happened. I don't know what time it was. I'd been deliberately not checking my phone much. Late. Post-midnight, probably. I was half asleep when it started. This long, low sound coming from somewhere to the north. A howling, but not quite the shape of any howling that I recognised. I've heard foxes at night in Bristol, and they sound like someone imitating a scream. This was nothing like that. Lower and longer, and it had a quality to it that I can't fully articulate. Like it was communicating something. Not in pain, not calling to another animal either. Something else. I can't really explain it. I lay still and listened to it for a while, and it went through maybe 3 or 4 cycles. This extended wailing note, a pause, another note, and then stopped. I told myself it was probably a dog, someone's dog on a late walk, or some animal I just didn't know the sound of. I'm a city person. My knowledge of wildlife sounds is embarrassingly thin. So I went back to sleep. But I thought about it the next morning when I was out walking. The 4th day, I went further north than I had before, following a path on my OS map that led up towards higher ground. The moor doesn't look like it has much on it until you're actually moving through it, and then you notice things. The way the land folds, small streams, the ruins of old walls half swallowed by moss and heather. I found the compass about 40 minutes in, just sitting on the ground off the path, face up, next to a flat rock. A good compass too, not a cheap thing. A proper orienteering compass in a red housing. I picked it up and looked around, but there was no one in any direction. I thought, someone's dropped this and it'll drive them crazy. I put it in my jacket pocket, thinking I'd hand it in somewhere. 20 minutes further on, a shoe. A single walking boot, men's I think, maybe a size 10. Just sitting upright in the heather, like someone had set it down to look at something and walked off. The laces were still tied. I stood looking at it for longer than made sense. It wasn't particularly alarming on its own. People lose things, people are clumsy. But there was something about the way it sat there, upright and neat, that bothered me slightly. Also, you wouldn't just walk off with your shoe missing. I took a photo of it on my phone. I don't know why. I kept walking. The backpack was another half-mile north, in a dip between 2 rises in the ground. A navy blue Osprey pack, the big kind, 65 litres or so. The kind you take on a multi-day expedition. I crouched down and called out to no one in particular, which felt a bit ridiculous but seemed like the right thing to do. No response. I touched it. It was damp with morning dew, which meant it had been there overnight at minimum. The top pocket was unzipped and hanging open. There was nothing inside it. The main compartment was zipped shut, and I debated whether or not to open it. Told myself it was someone's private property, and then opened it anyway. Clothes, a rolled sleeping bag, a gas canister. No food, which might just mean they'd eaten it. No phone, wallet, no ID. Everything you'd need if you were going to camp, minus the tent. I stood up and looked around at the empty moor and thought, this is probably fine. People are fine. There's probably a perfectly normal explanation. They set up camp somewhere and left the pack here for some reason. They came back for it and left again. I was narrating reassurance at myself, the way you do when you know you're spooked, but you don't want to be. I didn't find anything else. I walked back to my tent and made lunch, and tried not to think too hard about the 3 objects, spread out across maybe a mile of moor, like a breadcrumb trail in reverse. The 4th night, I woke up to noise outside. I'm going to be precise about this, because I've gone over it many times since. It was an animal sound. Snuffling, a wet, heavy, nasal noise. Close enough that I could tell it was maybe 2 or 3 feet from the tent wall. Moving slowly. I could hear the heather bending under weight. Whatever it was big. Not dog-sized. Bigger. I've never in my life been so committed to being completely motionless. I lay on my back with my arms at my sides and didn't move a single finger for what I think was about 45 minutes, though it felt like much more. The sound moved around the tent perimeter, past the foot end, along the right side, around to the back, and I tracked it without moving my head, just with my hearing, building a picture of where it was. It paused at the head end of the tent for a long time. I could hear the breathing, slower than I expected, deeper than a dog's. The tent wall dipped in slightly, as though something was pressing against it from outside. And then the pressure released. And then it moved away, and eventually I couldn't hear it anymore. I spent the rest of the night sitting upright in my sleeping bag with my torch in my hand, watching the tent door. And when it got light enough outside, I unzipped slightly and peered out, and there was nothing there. Just the moorland in early morning grey, totally still. I thought about leaving then. I almost did. But in the daylight, the previous night felt like something I could file under wildlife encounter. Something I hadn't identified because I don't know Dartmoor's wildlife well enough. Maybe a pony. Dartmoor ponies are everywhere. Maybe it had just come close out of curiosity. I talked myself into staying. The fifth night, I went to bed anxious in a way that I couldn't talk myself out of. I lay awake for a long time. I remember thinking around midnight that it was fine, that nothing had happened the previous night beyond an animal getting curious and leaving, that I was letting my imagination. Suddenly, the sound of the zipper. It was subtle, but definitely the zipper. It's an unmistakable noise. From the bottom of the zip, working up. The zipper pulls on the outside of the tent, being drawn upward. I was sitting up before I'd consciously decided to. I had my torch. I had my lock. I put it on before I'd gone to sleep. Threaded through both zipper pulls, 4-digit combination. The zipper moved up maybe 3 inches, and then stopped. The lock had caught. There was a pause. Then it tried again, harder this time. The whole tent door pulled taut as something yanked at it from outside. I was making some kind of sound, I think. Not screaming, more like the noise you make when you can't breathe properly. I had my torch pointed at the door, and the silhouette I could see against the tent fabric was wrong. I don't know how else to say that. The proportions were wrong. It wasn't a person, but the hands, and there were hands, I'm sure of that, something with fingers, weren't right either. Suddenly, another distant howl. It must have been miles away. The pulling stopped. Then something touched the top of the tent, pressing down. A consistent pressure that moved from the peak towards the foot end, like something was walking across the roof, something light. The pole structure creaked, and then the weight lifted, and I heard it move away, and the night went quiet. I sat there until 4 a.m, with my back against the far side of the tent and the torch on. And then I started packing. I've never packed a tent faster. I was doing it by head torch, stuffing things in roughly the right places, not doing any of the careful rolling that I'd been proud of on the way out. I got the tent down and got everything in my pack and started walking towards the car park, while it was still that pre-dawn grey before actual sunrise. I walked fast. I didn't run, partly because running on moorland in low light is a good way to twist an ankle, and partly because some part of me had the idea that running was the wrong move. I didn't look back. I know that sounds like the sort of thing someone says in these stories, but it's true. I made a deliberate decision not to look back, because I was certain that if I saw something following me, I'd fall down. and I probably wouldn't get back up. I found my car. It was the only one in the small parking area, exactly where I'd left it 5 days ago. The roof had a dent in it. Not a small one, not a parking knock or a hailstone. A large, central depression in the roof of my car, as though something very heavy had sat or crouched on top of it. The edges of the dent were pressed down and outward. Around the centre, on the slightly dusty surface of the car roof, there were marks. I didn't want to look at them closely, but I did anyway. They were like footprints, but the shape was odd. The length was peculiar, too long, narrowing at both ends. And there were too many toes, or what I thought were toes anyway. 6 or 7 impressions in a splayed arrangement, deeper at the ball. Like whatever had been up there had crouched forward onto the front part of its feet. On the driver's side of the bonnet, a streak of something dark and dried that I've told myself was mud. I got in the car and I drove away. I drove all the way to Exeter Services without stopping, and I sat in the car park there for 20 minutes with the engine running before I felt capable of going in and getting a coffee, which I drank in 4 swallows and immediately wanted another one. When I got home, I went looking for any reports of a missing person on Dartmoor around that time. There was nothing obvious. There have been disappearances on Dartmoor over the years, some famous ones, some less so. People get turned around, the weather changes. It's not a forgiving place. I've been thinking about that backpack too. About the fact there was no tent in it, only everything else. There's no way that someone would have just left their backpack there under normal circumstances. And I found it in a dip in the ground, sheltered, away from the main path. I've been trying not to think about what that might mean. About what situation would lead someone to leave their pack in a dip on the moor. Whether they left it, or whether it was left for them. I haven't called the police. I've drafted the call in my head about 15 times, and in every version, I get to the footprints on the car roof, and I imagine the silence on the other end of the line, and I close the imaginary call without even making it. The compass is in my kitchen drawer. I keep meaning to put it somewhere I can't see it, and I keep not doing it. Sometimes I take it out and look at it. Someone bought that compass, kept it in good condition, brought it on a trip they were excited about. They had reasons for going to Dartmoor and plans for what they'd do there. They didn't come back with it. I think about the howling on the 3rd night. Before I'd seen anything, before I'd found those things on the ground. That long, slow, repeating note. And how I'd lain there, deciding it was someone's dog. I'd like to still believe that, but I don't.